All right. Well, we are slowly making our way through the book of Hebrews. And Hebrews is written in the form of a chiasmus. It is written with a starting point that will build into a central key theme, and then we'll build back out. And we're at the very beginning of that transition towards the center. And the letter opened up with not doing the normal opening of a letter, but by just jumping into the main theme, which is the superiority of Jesus and how he is greater than what came before it. Initially, that was done with a contrast between the Word, that in former times, in fragmentary passions, God spoke to us through the prophets, but now he speaks to us through his Son. And the writer, which I believe is Paul, went through a number of characteristics, 7 characteristics of the Son that distinguished him and made him superior. So this letter starts with that, just lifting up of the superiority of Jesus, and then moves into the first main section, which again deals with that very topic, the superiority of Jesus. And we saw, starting in verse 5, that this is done here with a contrast between the angels and between the Son. And the contrast was, who of the angels did God ever say was his Son? And then we moved into verse 7, where he begins to expand on this a bit. He talks about, last week we finished, or 2 weeks ago we finished up with, now about the angel. He said he makes his angels wind and his servants flames of fire. And the imagery there can bring up a number of things. It can be that messengers of God are compared to wind and fire. Or it could be that he uses wind and fire as his messengers. Or that he can make his messengers into wind and fire. And we're not really completely sure exactly what Paul is saying here. But it is clear. You think about the concepts of wind and fire. Right? What are they? They're forces. They're forces that can't be resisted. Right? They can be used. Right? Fire can be destructive, but it can also cook a meal. And what do you do with fire after you're done cooking your meal? You extinguish it. Right? There's a temporary nature to it. Do we think of the wind? Well, maybe some places on the plains. But do we think of the wind as eternal? No, it comes and it goes. Flames come and go. Even when you have a destructive fire, it starts and it ends. Once it's gone, it's gone. And that's really what's being stressed here by the author, is that his angels are his instruments to use. They're his tools. They're his messengers. He sends them out. They do their job. They come back. Verse 8. But about the Son, he says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of your kingdom is a righteous scepter. And so here we come to one of the first really controversial verses in the book of Hebrews. We're going to come to a number of these. And there's a couple of issues going on in this verse. The first one is that first quotation here, throne, O God. And there's a translation issue here. And if you look in that ever-reliable New World Translation, which is the translation of Jehovah's Witnesses, they don't translate this as your throne, O God. They translate this as God is your throne. So, what's going on there? Do they just make it up? Actually, the New World Translation doesn't often completely make up things. They stretch them pretty badly sometimes, but we have to be honest, and we have to say that the New World Translation is at least possible here. And the way, I'm going to try not to get in too much into Greek here, but in Greek there's a whole bunch of cases. We have them in English, we just don't usually refer to them very often. But in Greek, you have a couple of cases that are particular in this verse. You have the nominative case, which is the subject of the sentence, and you have the vocative case, which is a case of address. And essentially, Greek determines its cases by the way the word is spelled. So it changes, like we have an ing ending, and that has a particular meaning, or if we put an s at the end, it means plural. Greek does the same sort of thing with their cases, and so you can tell what the cases are oftentimes by how they're spelled. Unfortunately, when it comes to the nominative case and the vocative case, they're both spelled exactly the same. So we can't tell from the spelling exactly which way it goes. And so that's why it's at least possible that the New World Translation is correct. So let's look at some of the evidence back and forth for this, in case you ever come across a Jehovah's Witness and you're talking about this particular verse, because this is one of the key verses for the deity of God. And in terms of the nominative case, or the Jehovah's Witness way of looking at this, there's a similar phrase found throughout the Old Testament. For example, God is my rock, or you can look at Psalms 18:2 for a series of these. So the idea of God is my throne isn't completely alien. It's not actually never found in the Old Testament, but we do see phrases like God is my rock. It also goes better with a variant reading of 8b, which is the scepter of his kingdom instead of the scepter of your kingdom. Now, we talked a little bit about variant readings in the last class. Yes?
If you look at the introduction to verse 8, it says, but about the Son, he says. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And if you want a proof of Jesus' deity, just go back to the second half of verse 6. Let all the angels worship him.
Yep.
We can only worship God. The Jehovah's Witnesses are trapped no matter what they do.
They are. And as we see, it's going to come out pretty hard for them here. But in terms of Greek grammar, they do have at least something to hold on to. So, well, the issue here is this his kingdom or your kingdom? And the word reading his kingdom is found in 3 manuscripts. It's found in basically Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, and P46. And those are all from the Alexandrian family. So it's from one family, 3 manuscripts, but they're very important manuscripts. They're generally pretty reliable. The other reading, his kingdom, is found virtually everywhere else. It's found not only in the Alexandrian family, it's found in the Western family, it's found in the Byzantine family, it's found in the Caesarean. So it's found all over. For me, one of the big things I look at when there's a difference in the manuscripts is how early and widespread a reading is. Early and widespread are both important. And because if someone made a mistake in one location, okay, I can see, these are all hand copied. Someone making a mistake in one location, fine. It's hard to think of someone making the same mistake in a whole bunch of locations. So I think the reading here is pretty solid that it is your kingdom, not his kingdom. There's also a problem with, we're getting too technical here, but if it's his kingdom, then you have a change from second person to third person, which is very awkward. So his kingdom as...
That's not what you said, okay. But I heard you say, maybe I misunderstood.
And maybe I misspoke.
I heard you say that there's like 3 instances where it says your kingdom, and all the others said his kingdom. That's what I heard you say.
There are 3 manuscripts.
Okay, 3 manuscripts where it says yours. And there's many, many, many that says his. And it seems
I'm sorry, then I said that completely backwards.
Okay.
Thank you. It is 3 manuscripts that say his kingdom. Everywhere else it says your kingdom. Sorry, I had that backwards. Thank you. So, that's pretty much it. The other item is you can argue that the essence here is, the focus here has been on the essence, the work of Jesus, his salvation, creation of the world, and not so much on who he is. So that might argue a little bit towards their view. As far as the vocative, the Septuagint version of Psalms 44:7, which is the verse being quoted here, is also seems to be vocative. That's kind of the same, not 100% qualifications, but again, context and all the arguments, which we're not going to go into, seem to be vocative. So it would be more likely that it be quoted as vocative. More importantly, the word order in Greek, since the words are spelled the same, the Greeks would, in this particular case, normally they didn't worry about word order, and they could move words around based on emphasis. But since vocative case and nominative case needed to be distinguished, they usually distinguished them by word order, and the word order here supports vocative. The other thing is, when we see it says about the Son, he says, literally that's, if you want to get really literal, that's to the Son, he says. So this is a statement of address, which would also support the vocative case. And then again, the overall context easily supports the vocative. So bottom line, when you look at all the evidence that we've just skimmed a bit of it here, when you look at all the evidence, it's the overwhelming majority of grammarians, commentators, translators, and general studies on this issue conclude that it's the vocative. And in fact, Bruce Mesker wrote it was highly improbable that it was not. So pretty much all the evidence is strongly against it. So when we look at this, we translate this as, your throne, O God. That's a very solid translation. So, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. Remember what he just said about the angels? They were wind and fire. Temporal. But here what's being stressed? The eternal nature. Jesus isn't something that God's going to use. He's not someone who he's sent to earth for a short period of time, and then after being on earth for a short period of time, he is done with him and, okay, move on to the next thing. Jesus is forever. His work is forever. The symbol of his righteousness, the righteous scepter, is a symbol of power. And the power that he exercises is exercised not on authority, although he clearly has the authority. Right? God's God. He can do whatever he wants. But that's not how he rules. He rules on righteousness. He rules on justice. And if you think about bosses you've worked for, right? All the bosses have authority because of the fact that they're your boss, right? But you probably think of, if you've worked for any length of time for any number of bosses, you probably have some bosses that are better than others. And you think about why they're better. Not necessarily that you like them better, but if you're judging them on how good of a boss they are, right? You probably rate the better bosses as the ones who were fair, who essentially didn't rule over you because they had the power, right? They could do what they wanted. They could order you around, and they liked to order you around because they liked exercising your power.
Consistency was important too.
What's that?
People who are consistent. Were
Yes.
easy to work for.
And then there's people who, they're just, essentially, they're the leader of the team, but they're part of the team. They're ruling on what's best for the team, what's fair. Well, essentially that's what's being said here. Jesus could exercise his power. He can do whatever he wants. But he doesn't. He rules based on righteousness. Verse 9, you have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. That is why God, your God, appointed you rather than your companions with the oil of gladness. And the term, you have loved, that's the aorist tense, which is stressing here the cause and effect nature. This is something that he has done. That he has, doesn't mean he stopped doing it, but it's basically saying you've already established this. That you loved righteousness and hated wickedness. That is why God, your God, anointed you rather than your companions. And here we have exactly the same issue we had earlier, because God, your God, could also be translated as, oh God, your God. This is exactly the same issue as in verse 8. And without going into all the details, this one is in the nominative case, which is not the vocative, which is why it's translated the way it is. But there's another question here. Who are the companions? That is why God, your God, anointed you rather than your companions. Who are those guys?
This is beyond all others.
What's that?
Beyond all others.
But then who are the others? Well, it could be the angels. Like, he picked Jesus instead of the angels, which is what, by the way, Jehovah's Witnesses would tell you. What's the problem with this being the angels?
Setting them at an equal plane.
What's that?
You're sort of setting them out at equal plane, which they're not.
They're not. But there's also, within the structure of what's being laid out here, who's he being contrasted against? The angels. And so if you're being contrasted against a group, they're not usually referred to as your companions. So this is them and Jesus as opposed to companions. It's far more likely that the companions here, and unfortunately Paul doesn't give us the exact definition, but it's far more likely the companions here are us. We're the children of God. Jesus is the Son of God. Why didn't he pick me? Right? I know why, but you may not yet. Probably do, right? Because he rules in righteousness and hates wickedness. And they anointed you rather than your companions with the oil of gladness. And again, this could be the Holy Spirit at baptism. Could be a reference to the message of salvation. In Luke 4:18, he says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me and has anointed me to tell the good news to the poor. Or it could be just the anointing as king. It could also be the oil, which is gladness, which is a general reference to the joy of the occasion. One of the problems with these early introductory broad statements is oftentimes it's not completely clear exactly what he's saying. So you can pretty much pick any of those.
What's the verse that you used?
Luke 4:18. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to tell the good news to the poor.
book I have is to Psalms.
Well, that's the overall quotation. This is being quoted from, this whole section is being quoted from the Psalms. This, by the way, is one of the largest areas of Old Testament exegesis, so to speak, where a writer has taken a section of the Old Testament and then sort of dissected it to get his message. Again, an argument in favor of his recipients being Jewish Christians. Verse 10, and in the beginning, Lord, you laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hand. So he switches to the acts of God. Again, distinguishing them. The angels do this? No. But Jesus, again, a reference to creation, laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. This is a quote from Psalms 102, 25 through 27. And again, this is an indication of the deity of Jesus Christ, because in the beginning, Lord, you. Now, who is he speaking of? In context, who's he speaking of? He's speaking of Jesus. Right? And yet, the word Lord in the Old Testament is Yahweh. The personal name for God. The name given to Moses at the burning bush. So, and in the beginning, Lord, you laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. Verse 11 and 12. They will come to an end. Who's the they? The angels. But you will remain forever. They will all wear out like cloth. You will roll them up like a robe, and they will be changed like clothes. But you remain the same, and your life will never end. All the things God's created, the heavens, the earth, that will come to an end. But Jesus will remain.
So the they in verse 11 are angels?
I'd have to go back and check my theology on that. I think it's more a reference to the creation. The they in the terms of the things that he created.
I would argue that it's talking about physical.
Yeah.
Physical beings or physical objects. The spiritual beings are eternal.
Like he created our bodies. What's going to happen to our bodies?
Right, and maybe I misunderstood. I thought you said angels under they for verse 11. That's why it's a question.
Yeah.
So you're saying that that's not what you're saying?
I'm thinking about that, and I'm trying to remember whether angels are considered eternal beings or not. I think they are, which is why the context and the way this flows, it seems, but then again, he just came off of talking about the creation.
Right, and the companions being maybe us.
The companions, I think, are us. Our bodies will certainly pass away.
How slow is that? We're going to see dust.
Yeah, our physical bodies, the earth, the creation that he has, will pass away.
I think verse 11 and 12 are contingent upon verse 10 as being an introduction of it.
Yes.
So he's talking about the heavens and the earth. Verse 11 and 12.
And I have to agree with that. Isaiah 34:4 is referenced. All the stars of heavens will be dissolved, and the sky rolled up like a scroll.
Yeah, I think he's referring to creation here, not angels.
Right.
So. Verse 13, returning to the angels. But to the which of the angels did he ever say, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool at your feet? You see how he's basically has taken those introductory verses 1 through 4, and he's expanding on that and emphasizing that. So again, as you read through something like this, think about what is the author actually trying to do? Why is he repeating this? Because didn't he just say this back in verse 4? Why is he saying it again? Emphasis. He's driving home a point. And I say if you want to get something, why, for example, you listen to a radio station. How often do they say the phone number for a company?
Ad nauseam.
And why do they do that? Because they want you to remember it. They want to drive that. You walk away from one thing about that commercial, they want you to walk away with their phone number. Right? It's emphasis. We still do that sort of thing. And this is one of the reasons why it's good to keep an eye on the big picture as we go through this. We're going through it verse by verse, but we want to keep an eye on the big picture to see what he's actually trying to do. What is the overall context? And so, to which of the angels did he ever say, "Sit at my right hand till I make your enemies a footstool for your feet"? The right hand is the position of power. He's going to dominate over his enemy. He's going to be victorious. Verse 14. All of them are spirits on a divine mission, sent to serve those who are about to inherit salvation, aren't they? So how's he view the angels? They're just, angels are what?
Services.
They're servants. And what's their purpose?
Minister.
To us. You ever thought about that? Their purpose is to serve us. Why? Why aren't we serving them?
Someday we will be higher than the angels.
And why are we hired? Because we're the children of God. We're the children of the
Yeah.
King. So again, he's contrasting the servants with the Son. And when you put it in that context, it's real clear where the distinctions fall. So, now we move into chapter 2, which begins, "For this reason." For what reason? Because of who Jesus is. Because of where he fits in the scheme of things. Because of what he's done. Because of everything that we've covered up to this point. For this reason, we must pay closer attention to the things that we have heard, or we may drift away. This is the first of several warning passages that are going to occur throughout this epistle. There are two things going on in this epistle. One, we're seeing Jesus lifted up. We're seeing Jesus, what he is, who he is and what he did, being laid out in very detailed fashion. But we also see, sprinkled throughout this at various locations, will be these warnings. And these warnings will get very severe at points. So severe that some people argue that there's actually two different people he's talking to. There's one group of people that he's talking to about how great Jesus is, and there's another group of people, completely different from this first group of people, that he's talking to about, you better pay attention, you better be careful. I happen to think that they're all one people. But as we get into some of the other warning passages further along, we'll get into that a little bit more. But one of the key questions as we begin to go through these warning passages is, who is he talking to? And when we get to chapter 6, it's going to make a really big, huge difference as to how we understand chapter 6. Chapter 6 is one of the more difficult passages in the entire New Testament, and it's difficult for everybody because it seems to say, for the Calvinists, it's troubling because it seems to say Christians can lose their salvation. Calvinists believe that's impossible. So then you might say, okay, the Arminians are correct then. But it's difficult for the Arminians because it seems to say if you lose your salvation, you can never, ever, ever get it back. And they have trouble with that. So these warning passages are going to be very difficult, but I believe that the warning passages were written to the same group that the other passages were written to. But there's only one group here. A group of Jewish Christians. It's a group, I think, very likely were the priests of the temple that it says many came to know the Lord after the resurrection. And I think because of the political, remember when we talked about the introduction of the letter, I think because of the political situation, with the conflict with Rome growing, there's this tug of nationalism that they were abandoning their faith at the time that their friends and family needed them most. And I think Paul is writing and lifting up Jesus the way he has to show the importance of Jesus, show who he really is and what he really did. And he's going to sprinkle this along with warnings not to drift away, not to fall back to the former faith. And so it's for this reason that Jesus is who he is, and he's done what he's done.
Could he also be talking about verse 2 there where he's saying, how can we ignore such a great salvation? And hypothetical, isn't he saying that, you say you're believers, but if in fact you ignore this, you better question your salvation. You better question if you really made a decision to follow Christ.
That's going to be one
it's
of the
not
questions.
saying lose your salvation, but have you truly believed to begin with?
That's actually one of the theories that people put forth. And one of the theories that as we go through verse by verse, and you look at the descriptions of who he writes about these people, you have to ask yourself, is he talking about Christians or not?
Christians who think they're Christians.
Or people who think they're Christians. So, this is, like I said, this is one of the more controversial sections and more difficult passages in the New Testament. So for this reason, we must pay closer attention to the things that we have heard, or we may drift away. So, one of the questions here is who could drift away? Going right to your point as to whether these are semi-Christians. Does he say, or you may drift away? Or does he include himself in this, that we may drift away? We're not going to resolve some of these issues today because they're going to build as we go deeper and deeper as the warnings get more severe. But one thing we can pull out of this is, do we need to pay closer attention? Pretty much regardless of who you think these people are, can we use to pay closer attention to the things of God? Do we oftentimes forget who God is? They're saying before class, do we sometimes find ourselves at the edge of the Red Sea asking God, why do you put me in these situations? Will we forget what God has done for us in the past? I think we do. I think it's just within the Christian condition. We get wrapped up in our lives. It's easy to forget about God. To forget who He really is. I mean, how often do we really think about God, Jesus, as the creator of the universe?
Every time I look out my window,
Well, that's good.
out in the country, it's just beautiful. Every time you see the sun.
When you look out in the country, yeah, it's much easier. When you're in downtown,
You need to be reminded once in a while.
I walk my dog at night and the stars are amazing.
oh, the heavens declare the glory of
Yeah.
God, the heaven firmaments His handiwork, yes. But yeah, we need to remember who He is. Lest, pay closer attention to what we have heard. And here the context is on the superiority of Jesus. Who He is. What have we learned about Him? We went through John. One of the things we learned in John was that to look at Jesus is to see the Father, because Jesus was in complete submission to the Father. He did nothing except what the Father would have Him do. And our goal in life is to be like that to Jesus. So when people look at us, they see Jesus. They don't see us, they see Jesus. That our lives model after His. Or we may drift away. And this is a drifting away that is the object of neglect, the result of neglect. It's not I'm going to abandon my faith and I'm going to go off and become something else, or I'm going to be an atheist, or I'm going to be, whatever. This is this sort of drifting. Some scholars actually argue that this is a nautical term. It's actually used in some cases in terms of a ship going off course. Okay? It's not clear whether Paul is intending it in a nautical sense here, but it carries some of that connotation to it. That it's something that through inattention, through the day-to-day cares of life, you just sort of, I'll get time for God soon. And before you know it, you've drifted off course. And that's what Paul's warning about here. Which would make perfect sense if my view of the historical setting is true, because this is a time of growing tensions with Rome, of conflict, and of beginnings of the rebellion that's about to break out. And it'd be very easy to get caught up into the day-to-day world of politics. I know we live in a peaceful time where nothing ever happens, right?
Yeah,
But
that's true. Emphasis on nothing ever happens.
But, they lived in a very contentious time. And it was easy to see someone getting so caught up in the politics of the day that they didn't have time for the Lord. Especially if in terms that we oftentimes tend to cloak our views in the mantle of God. We're doing the righteous thing. We're doing the noble thing. We're doing what God would want us to do. Which I believe is really what the Ten Commandments, do not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. I don't believe that's actually talking about, hitting your thumb with a hammer and using the name of the Lord in vain or something. I think what that really is talking about is it's talking about carrying the name of the Lord. It's talking about taking God's name and putting it on your beliefs, so that you can have, this. I'm doing this because this is what God would want. This is God's side. God's on my side. That's, I think, taking the name of the Lord in vain. As opposed to, I want to be on his side. And I'm not quite sure what that is. I hope I am. But that's what I strive to do. Verse 2, because if the message spoken by the angels was reliable, and every violation and disobedience receives its just punishment. So, you say, if the message spoken by the angels were reliable, is that going to have much weight with an atheist? So he's definitely speaking to people here. They may not be Christians, but they definitely believe in the Old Testament. They definitely believe what God has transmitted. Otherwise, this whole thing, this is a rhetorical question. Of course that's reliable. He's not questioning it. He's basically saying, rhetorically, if the message spoken by the angels is reliable, and every violation and act of disobedience receives its just punishment. Do we believe that as Christians? Aren't we free to sin? Yeah, kind of in some respects, but where did our punishment go? It went to the cross. It went to the cross. So when we sin, we are inflicting punishment, our punishment, on Jesus. Yeah, we like to think of it as all paid and done, and it is. God's eternal. But that doesn't mean we're not still inflicting punishment on him. Verse 3. How will we escape if we neglect a salvation as great as this? It was first proclaimed by the Lord himself, and then it was confirmed by those of us who heard him. So how will we escape if we neglect the salvation? And this is a theme he's going to build on in later warnings. If Christ doesn't bear the punishment for our sins, we will. And how can we claim, forget issues of theology, we'll deal with that later on in later warnings as to whether these are Christians or not or whatever. Just think of this in terms of you. If you neglect the salvation that God has given you, if you neglect Jesus, how then can you call on him to bear your sins? And if he doesn't bear them, who will? You see, these warning passages are not exactly easy, are they? This is the first one. This is the introductory one. This is the easy one. We'll put this in the context now of what we've seen of this letter so far. Paul is writing, or the author is writing, he's put a lot of thought into this. Think about the structure and the format that we've talked about. Think about the entire letter being written in a large chiasmus. The amount of effort that he put into this letter. And it starts off, oh, this is Jesus, he's great, he's great, he's great. Okay, we're all feeling really good about that. And then he starts writing these warning passages. And think about the heart that writes this. The concern and the love that he had for these people. That's what he's doing. He is reaching out to these people in a really big way with something extremely important for him to say. And I think it's something that comes down to us. Regardless of how the theology works out in later passages, it comes down to us that these are warnings written to us that are applicable to us. Let's go ahead and close in a word of prayer.